Welcome to Morningstar Christian Chapel YouTube channel. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, like button, and the notification bell so you can find out when we go live or post a new video. And be sure to leave a comment about what God has shown you in this message. Thanks, and enjoy the study.
All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to the Gospel of Luke chapter 22, verse 54. Luke 22, 54. As we continue our studies through the Gospel of Luke, we've finished the Last Supper. We have looked at that 1 hour walk that Jesus and the disciples took from the upper room through the temple area, out the eastern gates, down the slopes, into the Kidron Valley, and back up on the western side to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is located there on the Mount of Olives. We have looked at Jesus' arrival with his boys, the agony that the Lord personally spent for 3 hours, even sweating great drops of blood as he faced what sin would do to us as well, separate us from the Father, so that we wouldn't have to be separate. He would pay the cost. The boys, they just went to sleep. They were discouraged, we read, about what they had heard from Jesus. They were confused. They figured sleep was better than anything else. The Lord woke them up a couple of different times, told them, hey, just pray, you won't enter into temptation. But they went right back to sleep. Finally, the Lord let them sleep until the sound of those coming across the way told them it was time for them to get ready. Judas had come with nearly 1,000 men to arrest Jesus. They were armed to the teeth so that Judas could collect his 30 pieces of silver with a kiss of betrayal. Jesus questioned Judas about that. Then said to the soldiers, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus. He said, I am. And 1,000 people fall on their backsides so that they would know, the disciples would know, we would know that Jesus was going to give his life, but nobody was going to take him. About that time, Peter decided he would be Zorro. He was bad at it. Took a swing at somebody's head, caught their ear. This was not a good time to learn sword fighting. And Jesus said, look, Peter, put it away. You want to live by the sword, you have to die by the sword. And if I needed to, I could call 72,000 angels to help. We could each have 12,000 of them, or 6,000 of them. And Jesus said to the guys again, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus. Said, I told you, it's me. Now you let these guys go. And so Jesus picked up the ear of Malchus, he healed it, and he got provision for them to leave. We are told that in John chapter 18, that this detachment of troops and from the captains and the officers from the Jews as well, that they arrested Jesus and then they bound him. I thought that was pretty interesting, that he could knock the whole army down, but I guess some rope around his hands would work. Silly. And they took him away. But you see, something stronger than ropes was holding on to Jesus here, his great love for you and for me. He was going to see this through and please the Father. We read in verse 54, having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. Mentioned to you the last few weeks, but I'll mention it once again, in fact, probably several more times. Over the next many hours, Jesus would face 3 different little mini trials, 3 before the Jews, 3 before the Romans, all of them illegal. But the first meeting, according to John 18, was before Annas. Annas and then Caiaphas, who lived in the same palace, according to Matthew. And then they would quickly convene a meeting of the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night to kind of formally charge Jesus. The Jews had 2 high priests. That was never God's intention. It was supposed to be one. It was an example of the Lord that was coming. But Annas, who was the high priest by descendancy, had fallen into great disfavor with the Romans. They didn't like him. And so they took his son-in-law Caiaphas and said, we'll deal with him. And so, like I said, they had 2 high priests, but the people they still favored Annas. But the Roman government would only deal with Caiaphas. Now, we'll look at that next week. This story down through verse 62 is all about Peter. In looking at Peter this morning, I have great news for you. God knows all about you. And even if you fail, he won't. It's a beautiful story. It's one that I think should encourage all of us immediately. We start, though, with reading that Peter followed Jesus at a distance. Judas was with the betrayers. 9 of the disciples, it seems, ran off the minute they could. The Lord had purchased kind of their freedom, if you will. And then there was John, who, according to John's gospel, went in with Jesus, knew the high priest, and eventually came back out and said to the gatekeeper, let that guy Peter in as well. And so John 18 tells us that John knew the high priest. I don't know the relationship. We're told nothing about that. But he did get Peter access into the courtyard, if we will. The gospel tells us a lot about Peter. No disciple spoke in the Bible as much as he did. No one was addressed more by Jesus than Peter. Though he was bold in confessing the Lord, he more often than not spoke from emotion rather than understanding, at least early on. We love him because we, I think, can relate to him. He is most people's favorite apostle because he's just like we are. Peter was always talking, sometimes opening his mouth just to replace one foot with another. Other times when he spoke, it was almost immortal. It was the Lord speaking through Peter powerfully. And Jesus both approved Peter and then turned and reproved him in just a matter of minutes. Peter's real understanding of Jesus had started back in Luke chapter 5, verse 8, in his boat after he had been fishing all night. And when the Lord caused the nets to be overflowing with fish, Peter realized he had more than a fisherman on board. And he realized who the Lord was, and he got on his face in his boat and said, get out. I'm a sinful man. And he realized who the Lord was. In Matthew chapter 16, there at Caesarea Philippi, about a year from where we are, the Lord had asked the boys who the world thought that he was, who the people thought, who do you think that I am? Who do you say? And Peter said, and he spoke for everybody, because always Peter speaking. You're the promised Messiah. You're the Son of God, the one that we've been waiting for. And Jesus approved it. You didn't come up with this on your own. My Father in heaven has made that clear to you. But it was literally 17, 18, 19, 21, 26 verses later that Peter, when the Lord said, I'm going to die for you, Peter went, no, you're not. You're going to live. And Jesus went, yeah, now you're inspired from hell. He went from heavenly inspired to demonically inspired in 6 verses. That was Peter. He had a foot and mouth disease, but that didn't deter Peter. In Mark, no, I think it's not Mark, it's Matthew chapter 14, I think it's verse 28. Peter said to the Lord in a boat, can I come out there and walk on the water with you? He is soon crying for help, but he's willing. He's kind of a spontaneous guy. At the Mount of Transfiguration, when Peter woke up, because again, he was sleeping, and he saw the glory of the Lord and Elijah and Moses, he said to the Father, as the Father was introducing his son, let's build some condos for all of you. He went from insight to no sight in moments. To his credit, 9 guys ran. He did not. Impulsive, for sure. Earlier that evening, he had told the Lord he'd never wash his feet, and then in a moment said, give me a bath. That's Peter. I picture Peter as some big, loud extrovert who sweat a lot. Could be wrong, but he's fun to use as an illustration for just about everything. And every time I talk about Peter, I want to remember and remind myself, I've never walked on water, but he had. This story of his fall is no doubt the most instructive for us and the most difficult for Peter. It will bring him into a relationship with God that will sustain the rest of his life. It will be a lesson that will bring out a Peter that is indestructible and willing to eventually be crucified upside down and murdered. but he would have to die to himself. And to die to yourself is a horrible death. It is hard to die to yourself. Peter would go down in flames here, but in John 21, he would rise out of the ashes. Peter, notice we read here, followed at a distance. Peter would try to do what a lot of other people have done, follow Jesus from afar off. A lot of folks want to have that arm's length relationship with the Lord. They want the benefits of his promises afforded to the faithful without having to be so faithful. Bless me, Lord. But I just want to stay close, not that close. They're not enemies of Jesus, but they're the kind of people that would only vote for Jesus in a secret ballot. Unfortunately, afar off leads to isolation. Isolation often leads to denial. So Peter followed afar off. Verse 55, now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." In the dreary damp and cold of the night, Peter, at John's help, got into the courtyard where they started a fire. It was the middle of the night. Everyone was cold. Notice the word, they sat down together. Those who follow Jesus afar off are going to be comfortable sitting at the world's fire. It's just the way it works. You're not too close to the Lord, you can find a lot of satisfaction in a lot of different places. So as they stood by the fire and warmed themselves, Peter stood with them. He warmed himself. But not for long. The Lord had told them back in John 15, if the world hates you, it's because it hated me. And he was about to find out that's the side he chose. Verse 56 tells us a servant girl. Mark tells us in chapter 14 that this servant girl was a servant of the high priest, the one whose ear he had just lopped off. Looked intently at him, pointed at him. This man was with him. Don't know if she was in the garden earlier with a bunch of folk coming with the high priest, or whether he'd seen John maybe there before, and Peter and John were together. Don't know. I suspect that around this ring of fire in the middle of the night with soldiers who had already been up for several hours chasing a man that was willing to just surrender himself after knocking them down, that the discussion was about Passover and the amount of people in town and the stir that Jesus had caught and the weird assignment that they had just returned from. And they were just, maybe talking about, man, he knocked me down. I don't know how I felt. How did we all fall down? But into the midst of that sat Peter, who had assaulted the high priest. And he thought he could just blend in anonymously when this woman spoke up and all eyes turned to him. Now, we read in verse 57, he denied, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." So that's a bull-faced lie. "No way, woman." What? The man who was filled with promises? "Lord, I'm ready to go with you, even to die for you. These might all stumble because of you. I'll never be able to stumble." Stumbled. I mean, really stumbled. He outright denied the Lord. Outright lied. A little girl simply identifying him as being with Jesus nearly gave him a coronary. What are you talking about? Not me. Certainly not me. We read in Mark, now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You are also with Jesus of Nazareth," but he denied it, saying, "I don't know or even understand what you're saying." And he went over to the porch, and then it says, the rooster crowed. I don't even know who he is. The Lord had told them back in Mark chapter 14, tonight before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. Don't know if that came into his mind. The rooster crowed, the woman pointed him out. He got away from the fire, stood in some shadows. Maybe this would be better. Verse 58, in a little while, another saw him and said, "You are also of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not. So things seemed to settle down for a bit. Peter hoped that would be the last of it. The gospel accounts, as you put them together, shows us that several people at once now came to point him out. Mark tells us that this second accusation came from the same servant girl as the first one. In Luke here, it says another, but it's in the masculine voice, which would indicate it was a man who came to point him out. And in John, his reference is just, they began to question him, and it's plural. So the first one was an innocent girl who served the high priest. The second one got a little hotter. This girl and that guy, and they began to put pressure upon Peter. He tried to hide in the shadows, but no doubt the second challenge put some pressure on Peter, who's not at all prepared for this. He's still there. I can handle this. Hard to find strength from the Lord when you're following afar off and sitting at the fires of the world. Later on, the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4 would say of Peter's boldness, that guy has been with Jesus, and he was proud of it. But not here. Not yet. Not born again yet. Not filled with God's Spirit yet. Still trying to stand on his own 2 feet. But notice that one denial always leads to another. One sin leads to the next sin. There's an old saying that Satan's hounds hunt in packs. It is that way with sin. The first time is always the hardest. It's the hardest when you sin. I shouldn't have done it. I'll never do it again. But you already have. And so the second time becomes a little bit easier. The first time you swallow and you sweat palms and your heart races and it's a real battle. But then part of your defenses go. There's a great story, and you might have a chance to read it on your own in 2 Kings 14. It's about a fellow named Amaziah. He is known for meddling to his own hurt. But really the story is that he went out to fight in the power of the Lord, and the Lord gave him tremendous victory, completely outnumbered. Rather than coming home and saying, the Lord is good, he came home saying, I'm amazing. I am Amaziah. And he started to bring home some of the gods that he had conquered and the people that he had opposed, and he put them in his house. And the Lord began to speak to him, but he wouldn't listen. And then he challenged a more powerful man than he. The powerful man said, just be happy with your victory and shut up. And he goes, now you're next. Well, he was next, all right. The fight ended up in Amaziah's territory. Amaziah and a lot of his men were defeated. They were taken captive. Part of their city walls were destroyed. And that meddling to your own hurt, that's how sin works. You get involved, little steps. Go read about Lot. Lot saw the city and the land. He moved near the city. He moved into the city, and he spent his life in a sterile way without much fruit, losing most of his family to the city. For Peter, I think the second denial came easier than the first. In fact, if you read Matthew chapter 26, the second denial came with an oath. I don't know him, I swear to God. May God strike me dead. I don't know him. Because the pressure was on and Peter was pushing back just a little harder. Verse 59 tells us, then after an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow also was with him, he's a Galilean. An hour goes by. I'm sure that it was long enough for Peter to go, we're all right. We made it through. And he went back, according to Matthew, to the fire to warm himself. It was a cold night. How was he feeling? I don't know. Feeling like he got away with it, feeling like everything's going to be okay. I always read this and I say to myself, why are you still there? What are you doing there? Is it to show that you really meant business when you told the Lord that you'd die for him? Because you're not doing a good job of that. Is it just your stubborn determination to see it through? What he was unaware of is that in this hour, the news was spreading around the camp about him. This third challenge was much more serious than the first two had back. In fact, look here at verse 59. Look at the words, they confidently affirmed. The tense of the verbs would say they insisted and didn't stop insisting. They said it over and over again, pointing at him, yes, you're with them. No, it's you. We can tell even by your accent. Mark records, he denied it again a little later. They stood by him and they said, surely you're one of them. You're a Galilean. Your speech declares it. And it is there in one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him who Peter had cut off his ear, said, I saw you in the garden with him. Didn't seem like that was the girl. It was another relative of the high priest had gone with him over to the garden. So Peter is now in a lot of hot water. First a girl at the gate, then the girl at the gate with a lot of other folks, and then an hour passes, and now comes everyone. And this was a pretty tumultuous time. The first two challenges were tentative and questioning, but these were accusatory. These were considerably more dangerous. These were harsh words of angry men, and there was this mob that had already drug in, the criminal of the day. And the patio was closing in on Peter, and his third denial begins with him cursing. In fact, we read in Matthew, he began to curse, saying, I don't know the man, and immediately the rooster crowed again. Swearing, screaming. Verse 60 says, man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately, while he was yet speaking, the rooster crowed. What happened to Peter? Here's the guy who loved Jesus. Up on the second floor of this palace where Peter was downstairs in the courtyard, Jesus was being interrogated and asked the same things by Caiaphas. Or by Annas, I should say. They went there first. We read in Matthew these words, Jesus kept silent, and the high priest said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, as it is as you have said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his clothes. He's spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And the people with him said, he's deserving of death. Up on the second floor, Jesus is affirming who he is. Down in the courtyard, Peter is denying him. What happened to Peter? Well, I think maybe the biggest problem for Peter, and sometimes for us, is self-confidence. We somehow believe we're going to do better than we can. Peter's claim was that he would never offend. In fact, I suspect he could have said to the Lord, you named me Rocky, which is exactly what Peter meant. You called me Rocky, and saw himself as able. That scripture that says, if you think of yourself, if you think you stand, be careful lest you fall. Self-confidence is a horrible gift of the flesh. Certainly not a work of the Spirit. The secret Peter needed to learn, and we needed to learn, and will learn, is what Peter had said to them there down in the Kidron Valley in John 15. He had said to the boys, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you abide in me and I abide in you, you'll bear much fruit, but without me you can do nothing. Peter had heard that and then promptly said, I'm in. I can handle this. But it was a lesson that he would learn the hard way. Peter disagreed that for now, his strength would be sufficient and he doesn't need room for the Lord's words. But self-confidence sets God aside. I don't need your help. I'll do this for you. You'll thank me later. It really doesn't matter how strong you think you are. There are going to be places in your life you're going to come to that you can't handle. Doesn't matter what it is. Different for everyone, but you'll come to a place where you'll have to say, I can't. I can't. Pride goes before destruction, haughty spirit before a fall. If we don't learn to lean on the Lord and look to him as the only solution, it'll just be a matter of time before we fall. And Peter, at least now, at least here, was not convinced that what God said was true. He wasn't going to follow the Lord's counsel. Earlier, Jesus said to Peter, wake up, man. Pray. You want to overcome temptation? Pray. Peter said, yes, Lord. And then went right back down for another nap. Yet prayer is our strength. The breath of the believer is found in prayer. Prayer is where you build your house upon the rock. So Peter had self-confidence. That's a problem. And then Peter followed afar off. That's also a problem. For some of you, this is your only time in your Bible or reading it. That's not good. That's arm's length. It's not helpful to your spiritual well-being. And what happens when you follow afar off is you try to blend in with the world. But you should be sticking out, not blending in. We read it in Psalm 1 this morning. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, stands in the path of sinners, sits at the seat of the scornful. Blessed is the man who doesn't do any of that stuff. But that's where Peter is, down there in the courtyard, with no believers, no saints, nobody believing or trusting the Lord, nobody caring who he is. He's on his own. There's a great pressure to conform to the crowd when you follow afar off. And Peter has been working here very hard over several hours to not be so vulnerable. For the third time, he screams no way with a bunch of epitaphs, and the rooster crows. Verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. It's kind of a goosebumps verse, isn't it? I mean, Peter remembers the words of the Lord a little too late. But that's often how it goes with us. We don't pay attention until it's too late, and then we go, I should have listened to what the Lord said. Peter had been arguing with Jesus the last 3 or 4 chapters, disagreeing with him, disobeying him, fighting, now falling. But now all that Jesus had told him rushed through his mind in an instant like a knife to the heart. And Peter looked up, and Jesus looked down. Their eyes met. I can't imagine. Peter so hurt and ashamed to let Jesus down. He loved the Lord. He just had some stuff to learn. And no doubt Jesus' face said, Peter, remember what I told you? There's restoration coming. This isn't the end of the line. I'm sure it's a look of love and mercy from the face of the Lord, and you will say that same face if you're looking to get right with God. Welcome, mercy, grace, smile. I'm glad you came. Peter was, it tore Peter up. But the Lord knows our frame. Sometimes we expect more from ourselves than God expects from us. We think we can do it, but God knows we cannot. It really here, this disappointment that is in view is not God's disappointment, it's Peter's. God knew. And so we read in verse 62, Peter went out and he wept bitterly. For the next few days, Peter's life would be, I think, in the pits. He would be sustained by the prayers of Jesus, who said back in chapter 22, I've been praying for you. I'm sure that if he remembers what the Lord told him, he would be sustained by Jesus' promise as well. But I doubt it made him feel much better. I think the most important action to follow when you fall is to look up. Peter did that. Jesus was up in the terrace. He looked up. He fell, but he looked up. If Peter had not looked up, he wouldn't have seen Jesus. He was broken. He'd fallen into sin. He'd failed God, but he looked up. Now, fortunately, as sad as this, you get to verse 62 and go, well, now what? Well, now you go to the trials. But this isn't the end of the story for Peter. I'm glad it doesn't stop here. On the third day, on the day of the resurrection, on John chapter 20, Luke 24, on Easter Sunday morning, Peter and John were awakened by Mary Magdalene with the news that the grave was empty. They were startled, but they didn't wait for her. They ran to the grave. John, if you've read John's account, is proud to tell you he got there before Peter did. Literally writes that down. That just cracks me up. But he waits for Peter to go in. Peter didn't stop. He just ran into the place, looked around, and ran out. John put two and two together and at least began to think, gosh, what if he's alive? When all of the girls began to arrive there, Mary and then the larger set of women, they were told to go tell the disciples that Jesus was alive, but they said this, go tell the disciples and Peter. Be sure Peter knows. Be sure Peter hears. Because the resurrection would make his resurrection possible. There will be a very public restoration for Peter in John chapter 21. After the resurrection, Jesus will give Peter an opportunity in front of his peers to 3 times answer the question, do you love me? A couple of times Peter will say, I love you, Lord, I love you. Finally, Peter says, you know my heart. I'm not making any promises, but you know that I love you. But I'm not swearing to anything. I found myself at the end of my rope. Even later on in Acts chapter 4, and I know we've been going through that in the men and women studies, filled with the Holy Spirit, he stands arrested before this same hateful group of men in the same place where he's denied the Lord in this courtyard. But this time, with great boldness and faith, he prevails with God's strength, and he testifies to the gospel of Jesus and who the Lord is. Same Peter? Yes and no. Same Peter, not the same Peter. Now filled with the Spirit, heart right with God, forgiven of his sin, filled with God's power. Different God. Same intent, different strength. It's a great story of Peter. I mean, it's hard for Peter to hide. I imagine if I was Peter, I wish that wasn't all in there. Why do I have to be the example? But what an example he is to you and I. Look, if this morning you're far away, get close. I didn't say run ahead of the Lord, but at least get on his shoulder. Keep an eye on him. Don't lose sight of him. Because to get too far away from him, you're going to find yourself under all kinds of grief and difficulty. And the further away you get, the greater the enemy's influence. Why do you go to church all the time? I don't want to be out there. I want God to keep me close. Amen. Father, thank you this morning for your word to us. What a great lesson, Lord, that we would realize that Peter, who had a great fall, was certainly not finished, and you are not finished with him. And so as we watch him, on one hand, show tremendous courage, take out a sword and fight an army. On the other hand, show tremendous misunderstanding of who he is and what he can do, and self-confidence that really brought him to his knees. But Lord, that we would learn to fall upon your strength, to trust in your capacity, to allow you to keep us, to finish in us the work that you've began, and to go before us, to open doors that no man can shut, to close doors that no one should open. That we would be in touch with you and near to you and close by in prayer and your word, in fellowship, so that we would not be in a world that now denies the Lord, agreeing with them that there's two sides of the story. There is not. He is the Lord. There's no other name given among men whereby we could be saved. And it is his name that the church honors in the face of a wicked and angry world. Lord, you help us to stand and bear much fruit. And may we learn from Peter, and may you learn from Peter this morning that you're going to have to stay close. Don't have this arm's length relationship with Jesus. It doesn't work. If this is your entire Bible for the week, this is not going to work for you. You can't have a relationship with anybody that you spend 30 minutes a week with. Let God have some of your time. Draw near to him. He'll draw near to you. Shall we stand?